Okay, I'm going to make a recording about a few different things, I guess, but so the issue, I've been watching people debate free will, and it's quite interesting because I guess they're touching on the sort of the meaty parts of the matter, but of the subject, but they're not delicate enough, I would say, in carefully considering, the points that they're bringing to bear. And let me just get this out of the way because this is completely unrelated, although thematically perhaps not. I wanted to say something about social justice. Yeah, I guess the thing that I think confuses people in terms of refuting social justice, politics, and things like that is because, they appear to say the right things at some times, but they say them for the wrong reason. And this really has to do with, to sort of illustrate this issue, although not get into it technically. For example, the reason why you get sort of blind discrimination and prejudice, and this is not, let's say, exactly true in every instance, but this is a fairly good explanation for a large section of it, that isn't, let's say, just completely sadistic and opportunistic in terms of finding a cultural concealant for a kind of sadistic psychopathy, but I would say the reason why people feel impelled to let's say, and I don't believe that this should be enshrined in the law, but the reason why people commit hate crimes, which is a problem for criminal law, because to define it really is sort of, it's counter to due process. It actually sort of flies in the face of the rule of law even. It makes a mockery of law, and it turns it into the law of man quite patently. But just to get onto the point, for example, the reason why people, let's say, the reason why people beat up men who are wearing dresses, right? Transvestites. The reason why people target that is quite almost a naive sort of blind prejudice. It's because these people have been programmed, the people doing the beating up have been programmed essentially that moral norms come from society, they come from the external. They don't have an independent track. They're not keeping track and of their norms that they accord with a kind of authority. So, because, let's say, moral authority exists out there in their surroundings, in the ether, and let's just say they've got a norm that says that you have to treat women a particular way, you have to defer to women in terms of making them feel secure and things like that, and then you see a man dressed up like a woman and you think, now this is transgressing my normative value system, because they're confusing me. They're trying to cut in on the normative benefits that the system provides, and which I have to conform and follow. And because they don't have the independence to say, okay, well, I'm going to make an exception, that I choose not to treat this transvestite, I choose not to have that confuse my normative, sort of crystallized, sort of scripted narrative of how moral authority is sort of imprinted on their image thinking. They are forced into somewhat policing their environmental representation of that moral system and moral structure, because it doesn't exist essentially as in the proper use of the word normative. It's not really a norm. It's a so I mean, you could say that their view of moral authority or morality is it's in the water around them, in the analogy of like a fish in the sea, sort of it surrounds them, and so you are sort of threatening their moral system, or at least their system of authority, by not regulating society to conform to, you could say, that they're simplistic image thinking or whatever. So because essentially they just want to follow the external program, which is which they read into society, which they project onto society, you could say. So they're doing all these internal things which are misplaced, right? And so in order to keep that setup, that very basic setup, operational and functional and running, therefore they do feel transgressed. They feel that their moral system, their moral order is transgressed and affronted and threatened by people who are essentially introducing noise into the signaling, right? Now, social justice warriors and social justice in general actually believe in that external system. They believe that there has to be a narrative, and they actually believe that the counter narrative is needed to sort of balance things out. It's incredibly reactionary. It is the fascistic worldview, and in fact, it is exactly the worldview that I've just described as being naive and being the cause of the perpetration of hate crime. And so you've got social justice, which is the seed essentially of the fascistic cultural values and also so many problematic things. And so they will appear to be standing up for, in inverted commas, the rights of LGBTQ whatever people, but really they're on the side of promulgating the right image thinking, the right sort of pervasive authority which is imposed on the citizenry, from the top down or from the center or from some kind of so like they can appear, let's just say, to promote tolerance, but what they really just want is an orthodoxy, is a dogma, and they like agitating against, they're trying to reform this a confected, frozen culture that sort of enshrines their particular, sort of prism of these matters, of this, narrative or whatever you would. So, so what was okay? There was an overarching point about this, but so they can essentially only appear to ever say the right thing, but they're doing it for the wrong reason, essentially. And their rationale and their, let's say, their philosophical premises, their metaphysical commitments, essentially are a disaster. I mean, they are. It's not that they're poorly reasoned; it's that they're badly reasoned. They have bad reasons for their actions. and they're sort of stuck up in this sort of politics of appearances, and sort of policing the context and the narrative in some sense, instead of actually trying to ascertain what the context is. They are sort of projecting onto it just as badly as anything else. As any of the kind of the nascence and the sort of puerile hate crime mob, and this is why they have the propensity for, sort of groupthink and all the issues that come along with it. Anyway, is that really the only point? I thought that there was a deeper point around that. And I mean, there's so many psychological problems with this kind of schema, because it's sort of to sort of sustain that level of morality or moral system or moral order, which sort of hollows out independent tracking of things, and in fact it completely collapses the normative the deliberation of sort of criteria, and sort of the choice of criteria. It's more just a kind of a choice of an image that then you have to rationalize and align everything in accordance thereto. Okay, anyway, these themes do crop up in many different intellectual circles. I mean, it's very indirectly, let's say, related to arguments of free will and determinism. So now what I'm going to say is not going to be good for a standalone sort of talking or lecture, because I'm going to sort of address things that I saw in a discussion. So what did I want to address? That free will. Okay, let me think. What was the error that I kept on seeing being made? Begging of the question. What was it? Levels of description. Yeah, so I mean, I guess the weirdest thing in my account of free will, and it's been a while since I've sort of given a full rendition of it, but at least this brings all the issues to the fore for me, so I guess I can sort of get into it, is that in some sense I do employ a little bit of magic, and so let me start off by saying that and then clean it up in a technical way, because this does have a very precise model, which does sort of jot all the I's. So the magic that essentially saves free will is let's say the universal purchase of reason, is the force of reason itself, being a unity in some sense, and it's a unity as and in the self, and the self in this sense is defined as, let's say, the mental state. Now, there is no frame of mental state, there's no single frame that sort of compounds the sort of the characteristic of free will. It deals across how the self can, not does, but how it has the capacity, the possibility of utilizing its resources. And its resources essentially require a certain form of understanding. There are some understandings that effectively cannot contend free will in an obvious sense, other than in, say, the secondarily sort of indirect sense that the understanding is potentially capable of reform, of an internal sort of revision. And so you do need a kind of contemplative schema that facilitates free will, and it can be obviated, essentially, at least the pursuit and the actualization of free will is negated by the lack thereof, or the lack of the utilization thereof. Okay, now that contemplative framework deals with time. If you have a certain conceptual relation between yourself and time, specifically how the self is conceived within the different categories of time, so there's just say that there's the past, the present, and the future. And I'm not saying that the past and the present of the future exist in anything other than beliefs and notional devices which are employed in the present, that are related to from the position in the present, in terms of the mental state. So essentially, how the self is regarding the self in the prism of time, is going to produce a certain set of self-imposed constraints. And I mean this in a very neutral and technical way. Some constraints are needed in order for the will to choose reason, to elect reasons, or at least have a proper a proper recourse to past reasoning and access to potential reasoning or possible reasoning. And the obvious sort of evidence of this is alternative cases, and the self-report of indecision. So that would be, the simple ontological. The arguing against that not being an ontological position that is valid can only be justified by a hypothetical future frame in which the self has already acted after the future has commenced. So you've already kind of got a kind of erroneous hypothetical sort of engine to fuel the skepticism about the ontological veracity of let's say, contemplative possibility, as merely being a kind of abstract sort of internal bit of noise. I mean, to sort of you do basically have to beg the question from the point at which you have already by definition obscured the possibility of present agency, and because it's sort of been completely collapsed in the sense that the agent is just a kind of a hollow label that you're attaching to something that has already spent its description of agency. So obviously, if you're looking at something from the hypothetical framework of that it's already past, it's the future has already come and gone, which again, is sort of that I think should be taken to be the kind of almost a logically impossible abstract notion. It's actually a you can try to make that a contemplative model to use to argue your point about determinism, but that is the thing that is almost it's the problem is not that it's abstract. The problem is that it's logically erroneous. It's self-incoherent. It has conflicting prepositions. And it's only saved by simply saying, oh no, I am simulating that framework in my imagination. My imagination can contend such a scenario, and in a sense you can, but you are literally just wishing reality to conform to the presumptions that would make that valid, which I would even say in particular don't fly in terms of what we know about certain things. And that I would just cash out and substantiate by just saying the basic indeterminism. We at the very barest we can say that what physics tells us at the sort of at the deepest level of physics. And science is itself a big philosophical problem, because science is philosophically completely untrue and unusable to a large extent. It's actually refuted itself from an epistemological standpoint. It can no longer actually contend itself to be empirical in any way, shape, or form. In terms of empirical philosophy, it's out in the wilderness, but not going into those facets and details so much. It's not as if science can't be unuseful. You can still get, you can farm it for some things, but just because we all need food to live doesn't mean that we think that chefs have any kind of purchase on reality and the truth. There's essentially no good argument for science, and in fact all the good arguments are against it in that it has been self-refuting in its own methodological process. But the one thing that we can say about science is that it tells us that the base reality at the deepest that science can tell is indeterministic, which should also give you a clue as to therefore why predictability or falsification is just a complete shot and a miss in the dark. That we knew that at the outset it was a big gamble from the Newtonian model building of that we're going to eventually find the last piece of the puzzle and work out the mechanistic sort of machination, which only existed in Newton's imagination, and which, Newton was hated for a very good reason. He completely fucked up the philosophy. It was literally a Ponzi scheme gamble, and all the intellectuals knew it. But stupid people need narratives, essentially, and that is what essentially takes hold. And as a narrative, it's gotten us this far. it's also actually I need to make a recording commenting on some very interesting talks that I heard, or lectures being made about the Enlightenment and the problems in the Enlightenment, and how it actually put a large obstacle in the way of intellectual progress in some sense. It created a flourishing by creating an artificial boundary about certain things. Anyway, do not get too tangential into ranting. Okay, so I sort of followed a line of argument which didn't stick to the subject that well, but or that clearly, rather. Okay, so what was I saying? I was talking about how free will, the argument for determinism, how it begs the question, and how it's how it uses the kind. I mean, it uses almost the generic skepticism of the kind of the sort of the atheistic sort. That says, you know, if you can't negate this sort of the skeptical obstacle, this challenge to knowledge, if you can't sort of meet this particular bar, this standard, that you must be able to show through science that we have free will. Science must confirm your opinion, or something like that, or the fudged system of a half-baked empirical sort of to say something about authority, because it does have this very strange sort of David Berlinski is very good at debunking the stuff on a technical level. When it comes to Darwinism as well, but okay, so wait, I'm talking about. Okay, let me just try and get some new ground here. So I went through a stream of subjects which are all quite important, and which obviously I didn't fill out properly. But okay, so let me just go back to describing free will. So yeah, you need to model a kind of psyche, right? And I mean, the idea that you're going to get anywhere in terms of free will and completely sort of sideline any psychological factors as means that you're only going to emit a kind of free will which is like you can't but not have it, sort of thing. And then as soon as you define it as a capacity, you're forced into having a philosophy of mind, or at least some objects of a philosophy of mind to deal with those things. At which point you can't test it from the deterministic description of at any level of description. But even those levels of description don't fucking work. I mean, like, how are you going to reduce how are you going to reduce an agent into atomism? It's the essential unit of a materialistic atomist reduction. How are you going to, then you're no longer testing the proposition of free will. So you've created a level of analysis which it is impossible for it to connect to or engage with the free will argument, and if you Oh, okay. I did have a kind of an illustration of the fundamental sort of problem that deterministic people have, essentially. So, I mean, and I'm going to do this from a sort of a bit of a. I'm not going to do this in a technically clean way, but I think that that the argument actually is the underlying reasoning is actually there to be looked into and farmed. So the very scientific sort of enterprise, which I've complained is being fudged and not given like a full rebuke of it and debunking, but that whole fudge system, which is, really sort of groping in the dark towards completeness, that you just have to sort of buy into the Ponzi scheme that it's going to get there. But even the process itself, you can't even get predictability unless you have a real test. And can you have a real test under the condition of a kind of epistemological determinism? So you do get sort of problems that crop up very, very quickly. But what also deterministic people don't seem to actually understand is that nothing would even happen in science unless you had an agent that sort of initiates and science has to be employed basically by agency to even get it going as a process. And it's almost an implicit facet of the methodology, is that it depends on agents effectively to be outside the causal system. And if you think through this for any length of time, is the agent just acting therefore randomly and stochastically building up a bank of a kind of reactive regularity, which then is the sort of the canon of science, the so-called knowledge. I mean, if you can even call it knowledge. Everything sort of falls apart. I mean, you're challenging the foundation of epistemology at a level at which everything is just, is there a language? Is there a meaning? You're forced into a very kind of relative, subjective solipsism, essentially. I mean, you can be a coherent, you can be an internally consistent person who believes in determinism, but there's no escape for you in terms of solipsism, and essentially you are forced into the absurdism without an alternative. I would usually tackle this stuff almost on a spiritual claim and argument, and actually deal with absurdism and existential issues, because I do think that free will is something that effectively is in some sense it's more of a mental technology, a psychological technology that is constructed by yourself in the proper sense, and then it is operated by yourself, and you can say that, that's the narrative of free will agency or whatever, and I mean obviously there have to be quite a dynamic set of components that can sort of conform to that, but that is the sort of the low resolution sort of thing that needs to happen. And in some sense, when you're disputing over the realness of possibility and potentials, and following different reasons in different cases, I need to get into this sort of because what I mean by reason is a very complex issue in itself, and I haven't even really touched on that. So I mean, it's almost paradoxical that the more reason you have command over or access to, the more deliberate the distinctions you will make in terms of your course. So the less random, right? So you use reason to overcome the randomity, and but then the question becomes, well, is reason itself a predeterminism in some kind of abstract hypothetical contemplation, which only really works if you take reason from some kind of half-baked frame of the future that has already happened. And essentially this is the problem of materialism that it gets into, is that materialism fundamentally conflates something like that absurd notion of the future that has already happened, because that is the only way that you can condense the notion of materialistic whatness, what is it, what are things, that the only way that you can ground that without mind, without a kind of origin of epistemic authority that flows from reason via the conduit of the mind state of the self, it has to be somewhat independent, and the only way to make it an independent objective feature of reality or something like that. And again, this flies in the face of sort of what we know from the indeterminism of science. We should actually negate the idea that that there is even such I mean, in some technical sense, if we lived in a deterministic universe, then it is true that you could that there is such a at least abstractly, there is such a notion as a future that has already happened. But whether or not, I mean, to me, it's moot whether that has an ontological basis to it or not. It doesn't matter. The point is does the self have an ontological access to that frame? And in some sense, we can explore it to the extent, but it is purely imagined. It is the imagination. And I would say that people are being dishonest about their imagination. They're being imprecise and fudged and half-baked. In the same way that people will say, oh, right now I'm imagining a square circle. No, you're not. You're a liar. You're not imagining a square circle. And I think that in the same way, that's the only, so people utter things that are utterly nonsense, and they get away with it because it essentially just plugs into this orthodoxy that we have running around, which conforms with this kind of skepticism that unless you can sort of overcome the challenge of that piece of objective certainty which is made out of this nonsense, and it makes the self such a nonsense essentially, because it essentially robs the self of coherence and says that no, actually there's this unknowable certainty which just doesn't conform with our mind states, therefore we are abject beasts conditioned by this superior contemplative mathematical thing that it must exist because I have said it, just as I can say the words square circle. But it's bullshit. And this is essentially what these people trade off of. This is how they have allocated to themselves their dominion, their intellectual self-sufficiency, and anyway, that's enough of a rant. But I think it might have been a mess, but I think that actually deals with all the issues.